All right. So given the fact that we usually have a bit of announcements and we have a fair bit to discuss today, I'm fairly certain we will probably be using the full hour and a half today, as this is our final identification meeting. So we head into end-to-end review after this. We're actually really well positioned, I think. We only have a few more things to review for programs and digital literacy. So thank you all for being here. We really look forward to talking to you about the work that we've done since we were last together. Next slide, please. Thank you for joining us. We always start unmuted, and upon entry, we record the call. As you notice, could we just hit the record button? And those recordings are always available on the Confluence after the call. We do work the chat very actively. If anyone wants to put who they are and what organization they're from in the chat, it might help newcomers in the call. Again, I am Sarah DeSilva, the Director of Terminology. I'm here with members of both the terminology and technical team from the Gravity Project, and then there's many friends who've been here for some time. If you are sending elements in the chat, sending notes in the chat, please make sure they're sent to everybody. If you send them to just me, I'm likely going to read them out loud anyway. So just if you keep everything to everybody, you're in a pretty safe spot. Next slide, please. This is the common antitrust practicing slide. We all have the responsibility of complying fully with federal and state antitrust laws. We repeat this every meeting. I'm not going to go into it further, but just know that that's part of the rules of engagement within this space. Next slide, please. These are our Gravity Project sponsors. As you all are aware, we are a sponsor-driven project. Incredibly grateful for both the monetary in-kind supports that keep this little project running. Again, 2023 wouldn't have been possible without them. So thank you so much to all of them. And thank you to our in-kind support that comes through, notably the American Medical Association, who is a sponsor across both in-kind and monetary support, Civitas and Saffron Labs. Next slide, please. There's a lot of Sarah on this agenda, but hopefully it'll be more broad than that. We are hoping to have some of our subject matter experts here. We've had lots of conversations over the last 2 weeks. My team will help me understand who is here from the SMEs, because I certainly cannot see you all. We're going to go deep into digital literacy and digital access concepts, really focusing on some definitions and diagnoses that we've come up with since we last saw you. We're going to be following up on some of the questions and ideas that you all raised with us last time, especially regarding access and accessibility. And then we're going to be closing with homework and next steps. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just general announcements. Again, please do try to join the technical work stream when they meet Wednesdays 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So they meet regarding both Connectathon planning and talk about technical elements. Again, you can find that meeting on the HL7 calendar. There's also links directly on the Confluence. We are looking forward to our Connectathons. The July Connectathon is coming up ever so shortly. We'll be looking to some exploring and leaning into some work that MITRE is leading on eligibility use cases. Again, that Wednesday IG meeting is a good place to go. All the information on all the Connectathons and all the meetings can be found on the Confluence always. Next slide, please. Again, I think we talked about this last time. Just for those who are not aware, Gravity is leaning in to a social care voice co-design project that's going to be professionally facilitated with a really lovely representation of social care voices, really making sure that the social care perspective is included in our implementation guide and terminologies. So that's going to be running late summer to early fall. And thank you to our friends at Civitas and RWJ for making that possible. Not going to go into it further. There's going to be lots of information on the Confluence again about that, the plans for that work and the outputs of that work. And we're very, very grateful to have this intentional time to make sure that the social care perspective is represented in what we do. I want to give a nod, I don't know if he's on the call, to our friend Mike Klinkman, who's been helping us vision some of that work. He probably is not on the call, but just note that there's a group of core members of the Gravity Project who've helped us frame this work together, and we are looking forward to centering those voices. Oh, hi, Mike. Yay. Thanks for your thoughtfulness, Mike. We're always glad for your thoughtful engagement in the work that we do. Next slide, please. Next slide. No changes to the roadmap right now. You might see a few things in terminology come up in the fall. I think we talked about this last time as well, but as part of our alignment with HL7, and we actually used to have this as well, we're restarting what's called the operating committee, which is this body of engaged members who will help pick from the vast list of things that we have in our sandbox and in our possible to-do list and help us prioritize what's coming in the fall in 2024. So as that group starts to identify things that are priorities from multiple different perspectives, you'll see things start to pop, and maybe in late 2023, but definitely in 2024. Nothing incredibly new happening, but all that work of the IG happening in those Wednesday meetings. Again, please go to the 1 to 2 meetings if you have a technical bent. And please sign up for those connectathons because they're really important for helping us understand the applicability and usefulness of what we do. And we invite all of you to come join Civitas and Gravity at the pilot work stream as well, where we're some pretty exciting, massive pilots going on, which is partly why I feel like it's a very, very busy time. But we welcome you to join us over there as well. Next slide, please. Any questions regarding announcements and updates before we head into the work? Okay, next slide. Next slide. Here we are. We're in the identification phase. So this is the last meeting that we are just focusing on identifying and filling holes. We go into a process called end-to-end review after this meeting, which lasts a month. It's a pretty lengthy time. We'll describe more what end-to-end review is when we enter into it in 2 weeks. But really, in principle, it's just sitting back, reflecting on what we've done, making sure it's good, right? Like turning it around, or things missing, or things in there that shouldn't be in there, are there refinements and how we've said things that we feel like could be different. And the truth is, in all the complexity of where we've been, we're pretty well positioned to do that work starting very shortly. So well done all. Next slide. You can see this carried out in the agenda, in the schedule of activities, right? So here we are at 7-6, which is in the identifying concepts phase. Next, the 20th and the 3rd of August is that end-to-end review. And then on the 17th, we close this public session, even though we'll likely probably still have public calls, because there's a lot to work on. We do not plan on sunsetting the public call completely, even if we're not doing build, because there's a lot of work to do and we want to make sure that we're staying engaged with you. At least that's not the plan right now. You can see, so we finish concepts and then we do end-to-end review for a month, and then we go into the vote in the middle of August. Next slide, please. And then you all know this, so we alternate between our internal meetings with subject matter experts and you all, and then when things are identified and finalized in the course of this meeting and those SME meetings, we move them onto the master list. Next slide. Accessing the master list, this is how the review happens. So we don't bring every single element to these meetings. So as we think about heading into end-to-end review, once the master list gets updated the next time, which will be at the end of the day tomorrow, and there's a lot of work to do. So if we don't update it by the end of the day tomorrow, we'll let you know. It's definitely going to be there by Monday. But the best way to do that end-to-end review is to download the master list and look at it. It's a spreadsheet, we've built it for this purpose. And so it's a work in progress now, but as we go into end-to-end review, that's the best way to access it, is to look at it, take it into your own space and just try to figure out whether it seems complete in your eyes, field it with people in the ecosystem that you work with, really try to test it out to make sure it's good. Next slide, please. Okay, are we ready? There's a lot to talk about. Next slide. Here we're going to go into the meat of the day. Reflecting, this is really the most applicable example of what we do in our work, which is, I call my brain rock tumbler work that we do is very similar, where we just, look at things from multiple different angles, test them with questions, test them against the evidence, test them against applicability and use cases and clinical practicality. And finally, at the end, we end up with something that seems like it's going to work. I really want to give a centered thank you to our SMEs who have helped us along this process. They have been so patient and thoughtful. Digital literacy and digital access are complex domains, and so we could have done it without Walter Suarez, Adriana Nava, Adrian Aguilera, Blumi Cambajola, and Jorge Rodriguez. So thank you so much. Again, just so wonderful to have you all here in this work. And hi Ruth. I'm glad you can at least call in. And if you have, I'll definitely send the slides and then have the recording if you want to review it later. It'll be on the Confluence. Next slide, please. All right, just again, background, digital literacy was born out of health literacy. Digital access is an element that we pulled from material hardship. And we've kind of centered similarities across those domains as we've gone forward in our work. Next slide. And now digital access. A few updates here, really very just simple, practical ones based on what we know. I do want to note that I'm very, very grateful for the community members who've given us resources to help guide this work. So you're going to see some voices from the community and some of the work that we're doing across these domains. And then definitely, as we consider accessibility and language translation, you'll see some elements there at the end. We've saved those kind of in a bucket. Next slide, going into digital access. Now that we're getting close to the review, you're going to start to see us move away from just simply talking about definitions to try to figure out how we're going to build these things into code, right? So the thematic presentation today, you can see there's a column for IC10CM proposals. There's a column for SNOMED CT terms that would map to them. And then there's a definition. This is important because each of the terminologies we're working within have structures that define how terms should be built within them. And so we want to start to map out and need to start to map out where they would go. So as we've been discussing with digital access, an element of digital access is whether there's internet service in the community at all, right? So it may not, I mean, from rural Vermont, I'm very careful to note this is my daily life in clinic. Right. So when we consider that aspect, it's really important to define that it's an adequate digital access due to inadequate internet service in the community. Right. There is an area in ICD-10-CM that's appropriate for community level concerns. It was rebirthing it. The Z58 series was part of our early work in Gravity. We actually had to create that to create our first, pull it back into use in order to create our first terms for food insecurity. So if we can imagine, there might be an ICD-10-CM term for inadequate digital access due to lack of internet service in community. There would be a mapping SNOMED CT term for the same. And then the definitions would be inadequate access to digital services and information is living in a community where internet service is unavailable or unreliable, right? So this is the synthesis of the work we've been doing over the last couple of months. And it's kind of a place to sit in as we think again about end-to-end review. And then one of the things that we're kind of testing is whether we need a community level asset term, because usually, remember, we build not just problem statements, but asset statements too, or goal statements. And so we want to ask you all whether we need, so Tom, you'll see the affordable in the personal level, because if it exists in the community, but cost is the barrier, that's going to be in Z59, right? If it doesn't exist in the community at all, lack of broadband, no cell service, that's not going to be something finances can address. You'll see us pull that theme in when we go into the next slides. Sound good? I hope it sounds good. So, but first right now, we're wondering whether we need a community level asset term, such as living in a community with adequate internet service that you might be using in a plan of care. Like, anyone have thoughts or attachments to whether we would build that term? No? Or is it something we can just think about as we go into end-to-end review too? Because that's a very appropriate question for end-to-end review.
Just comment from here if I could.
Amy, hi. You'll see your wisdom is throughout these slides, so we'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, thank you. I may have said this last time, but I've just been doing some research for a health affairs piece, and what's really apparent is how much the shift is moving from not having no internet to not having fast internet.
Okay.
So when you look at the divide of who does and doesn't have access to speeds over 50 or 100, it looks exactly like internet adoption looked like in the year 2000. In other words, if your
Mhm.
income is over 75,000, if you have a college degree, you can access high speed.
So how are you, are you thinking that we need to integrate this the into the definition, or how do you want us to approach that?
I I really don't know. I feel like this is such an emerging, side of the digital divide, or that we're in such a transition. And I haven't heard a lot of people talking about it. You know,
Okay.
I I feel like it just needs conversation about how to address it, because a lot of people aren't going to know what speed they have. They might know something like not fast enough to do what I need it to do.
And so we tried to capture speed in reliable, but maybe that's not appropriate. So you're wondering, I guess, to synthesize, whether we need to integrate like of sufficient speed to do blank blank, somehow integrate speed into our definition. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, because the ISPs have done tier flattening so that instead of offering slow internet to poor people for less money, now they're asking for the same amount of money for slow internet as they
Okay.
ask for high speed internet in other locations. So it's like this complex, combination of speed and affordability.
So Sarah has her hand up. Sarah, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I think one thing, I don't know the terms that they're using in Colorado, but they have a whole digital equity and also like broadband kind of initiative that is more focused around health access.
Mhm.
So I wonder if I can go and look and see what they are doing and talk with the people who are running that, because I think that there is some pretty probably more language based in that internet like provider space. Um, and then also I would say it would be access to digital like digital healthcare or something like that. I mean, you would think that it depends on what we're talking about. If they're able to access, video and audio conversation. Um,
So I'm going to try to answer your questions in turn and link it into another question I saw. So um, number one, we have a pretty amazing repertoire of frameworks we tried to like smush into here without binding ourselves out of rurality or different kind or like linking ourselves necessarily to broadband. So there's a lot of, we would love any resource you have. We are not just talking about the healthcare resource here, because of taking care of humans, we also need to be able to enable employment and education. So we're always thinking beyond just the healthcare use case. And we are asking for a new SNOMED CT code. I'm sorry. Yeah, so the SNOMED CT term would be new, would be mapped and mirrored exactly to the ICD-10-CM code. And then we have devices and everything else covered in the next slide. It might be helpful to move to that, because again, we're just trying to represent what's the community level element, and then in the person level element, ability to afford connections, ability to, having a device, all of that is in what it basically necessitates having the community access out there in some settings in order to be able to have the connection to in your home or in your device, or even having a device to use it. So that's on the next slides. And then oh, Tom, that's nice. That kind of carries down, the definition carries to other ways we've approached it in the past with other domains. And then Lucy, do you want another thought before we move on?
Yeah, just quickly, I almost never want to narrow the frame of reference, Sarah and everybody, but I was thinking if we develop a new code that indicates inadequacy somehow, that seems to me to become a fantastic research target to document where more needs to be done. So I'm thinking of a new code more politically than clinically. And therefore, my thought is that our definition of a new code might merit, at least in the short run, living in community with internet service adequate for healthcare. If we did that, and there's a lot of use of this code indicating that it's not true, that becomes a fantastic source of information for agitating for it to become less true and eventually not true anywhere. So that would be a rationale in my mind, not thinking of whole person access, employment, education, and all of that, at least in the short term, because for some people, having internet access sufficient for their health care could make an enormous difference, regardless of access for other use cases.
Thank you, Lucy. We are pretty clear, at least so far, that we do not want to limit to just healthcare. And I think actually as a clinician, most of the problems that I deal with within digital access are actually not linked to the healthcare use case. They're linked to employment and education. So I'm cautious to change our approach now when we would only be telling a partial story, you know? So thank you, Sarah. We do have these references within our reference library. So we appreciate them. Does that make sense, Lucy?
It depends on the time frame, and it depends on relative priorities. I'll just leave it at that.
Yes, okay. And then Janet, one more comment, one more thought on access again, because this is a lovely conversation to carry into the refinement is a lovely conversation to carry in as we go forward into end-to-end review, over the next 6 weeks. Janice?
I just want to concur with what you just said, Sarah, because we know that in some of the digital services, people are usually looking for housing, foods, they're looking for things like that. In healthcare, what happens, to be honest, Lucy, portal usage is not as high as we would like it to be. Patient portal usage is, if you have 20% of your patient panel uses portal, you're doing really well. But they look up information and they can get into a mess by looking up the wrong information on the web, right? Like if you just put something in a search engine about your disease, a whole bunch of pharma could, there could be a lot of blogs and editorials and people might not know where to go to the right area. So just overall digital services is really important and often, yeah.
I don't usually do this, but I'm going to ask Ashley that we go through the whole deck. I don't usually do this because so many of the themes of digital access are related to digital literacy, right? And and we want to make sure that you all see the person level terms that we have before we start seeing that they're missing. So I'm wondering if we can just roll through and then come back. Is that okay? Just so everyone sees all of the terms that we've drafted. And then we can comment on those some set. Does that seem okay? Because there's healthcare use cases later, there's personal access, there's affordability, there's devices, there's all of that stuff comes in a few slides. Does that sound good?
Knowing what's coming, Sarah, I think that's a good plan.
Okay. All right. And then if this is a bad approach and it somehow doesn't feel like it's honoring things that need to be said, just let me know and we'll stop. I don't think we answered the question on the slide, but we can come back to that in end-to-end review. So we're going to hold space for the questions you have, and we're going to see how they're answered as we go forward, and specifically into the next slide. Great. And then Sarah, that's a really good thought. We can think about that later. Digital equity is so multifaceted. That's a really good thing to think about. So the next things that we would be high-level digital access concerns that would be, again, at the level of the person, or things that we can solve directly with interventions within the clinical settings or educational settings. So we would have a high-level term for inadequate digital access built in both ICD-10-CM and SNOMED CT. And you can see some themes here. So we have lack of reliable and affordable access to internet. And we can refine if we have a definition that we feel like we need to shift here slightly, we are always able to do that. But lack of reliable and affordable access to internet service and a digital device that sufficiently meets the user's functional needs. Functional needs is important because you can see that we've tried to address your concerns with assistive technology and translation later on in the slide deck. We did want to see it, and what you all, it's the first folks who are not terminologists, it's really important to note. You can see that there's limited real estate in ICD-10-CM, and there's a sufficient ability to refine to specific types or subtypes of inadequate digital access, or any term within SNOMED CT. So where there might be one term in ICD-10-CM, there's going to be a breadth of possible documentation in SNOMED CT, including those healthcare use cases, and we'll see that shortly. So we wanted to make sure, given our past conversations, that we allowed for a term inadequate digital access due to lack of desire for digital access, because just because someone doesn't have it doesn't mean that they want to. We had talked about Luddites on the last couple calls, so we were suggesting a term to state that yes, this person does not have access, but they don't want it, so let the Luddite be, right? And then there's the very specific term inadequate digital access due to lack of digital device, like you do not have a device. And we might evolve this a little bit because you can see in our goal statements, we changed the definition of the term for a digital device a little bit from, I think was from Digital Us. And we'll come back to that shortly, but this is when the meta term, like you don't have a digital device. And then the other one would be when it's driven by financial resources. So inadequate digital access due to lack of digital device due to financial resources. And there's all precedent for this in terms we built before within SNOMED. Yes, you're going to see this on the next. So this is the device slide, and now we're going to go to the service slide. So next slide. You're with me, Tom, right? So all linked again to that kind of big bucket ICD-10-CM code, knowing that all of these facets are part of digital access. We wanted to make sure that we built terms to talk about enrollment and service as well, right? Knowing that the community stuff is there, maybe. We wanted to build a term for inadequate digital access due to lack of enrollment in internet service, or inadequate digital access due to lack of enrollment in internet service due to limited financial resources, right? And again, these are things that we intervene on in clinical and educational and occupational settings all the time. So those, again, that would be the breadth of the terms that would be across, like, so you state that it doesn't exist in the community. And I'm going to, Tom talked about this a little bit. I think it was Tom in the chat, but from a rural perspective, I have patients that do not have any access to broadband and have no cell service in their home. And so I literally get too much for them, and I was telling the story of many of my patients. I do addiction medicine. In the parking lot of the Maple Fields, because they can get service on their cell phone in their car on an app that I send that's HIPAA encrypted to their phone, right? But they can't get it at their house because there's no service. They can't get it anywhere else, right? So from a rural perspective, that community level term really is really important. We can figure out how to define it better, but it is important. And then you'd see, so we have the two device and service elements that we would have built out in SNOMED CT. How are we thinking about that? Any Teresa, you can see us, there's some using applications as part of, you can see that theme figure heavily within digital literacy that we'll be addressing next. Any other thoughts now that I've gone through at least the digital access elements? How are we feeling about these evolving terms? We feeling good?
And Sarah, I'm wondering though, if Teresa's question was about the ability to afford the apps on your device. I don't know if she's talking about apps that have to be purchased, that I wasn't clear on.
Yes, purchased or downloaded or recommended. So yes,
Yeah, so the downloaded we'll handle later. Yes, Sarah. Yeah. The
Okay, so that's-
purchased might be its own thing at some point later.
yes, and I think I'd need to, again, ignorantly, I'd need to understand the use case for missing paid applications, right? Across the core, like essential social domains, like applications you pay for. Because most, like I think about your bank, your school, healthcare, employment, most of those are free. But I might be wrong. And this
yeah,
is the
but you look at, say, yeah, like Microsoft Suite, you might need for employment purposes. You might
Oh,
have
okay.
Chalkboard for education, there's some different things.
Okay, so if you can, this is the perfect thing for you to write out as a use case and send to us in an email so I can better understand. And then we'll elevate it to our, because it's easy enough to say inadequate digital access due to inability to afford essential applications, due to limited financial resources, right? So we can definitely, and we'll have to reference the literature because everything that we build, just this, like the literature Sarah was putting in from Colorado or digital, all the digital inclusion literature, we'll just go make sure that there's a map to that in the lit. And if you send us the case and an email, we'll integrate it because you're going to see there's so many themes from the public integrated into the slide deck. So Rita, you're asking lack of enrollment. We really wanted to make it clear that this was at the level of the person. So it exists there, like I haven't enrolled in the service. Because we also just didn't want to repeat access all the time. It could be refined. So Rita, that's what we meant. Like by signing up to Burlington Telecom, I'm enrolling in the internet service to my house, right? By getting data on my cell phone, I am enrolling in a service for data to allow streaming on my phone, right? So that was our approach there. Okay. How are we feeling though? General approach, are we feeling good? It sounds like it in general. Okay, I'm gonna keep
Sarah-
moving. Hi, is
Sarah,
that
hi,
Cory?
this is Court. Yeah, and this is just
Sorry.
a minor thing. I do find myself, when I see the chaining of the do tos, this is getting like I find
know.
myself parsing it. Like, does that mean something different if it's due to, I think it all works semantically, but I did just have that reaction to the multiple do tos. But
Yeah, it might need to be wordsmithed a little bit. Yes.
Yeah, this is Teresa again. So in the field, I know we see instances where they don't have unlimited minutes. So they, run out of minutes. Plus on the internet service, at certain times of the month or even
Yeah.
times of the day, it's throttled.
I think, I don't know if other people in here, but what I hear you saying is it's not just lack of, we need to build a not enough.
So ironic that
Yes.
we lost her at just the moment she was talking about losing.
I know. I think that's appropriate though. And Teresa, thank you so much. So we want to make sure that it's not just, we're not just building lack, but we're like running. I can attest, you're absolutely correct. People running out of minutes at the end of the month. That was my life when I was a grad student and had no money and I was a single mom. So I can attest that is a thing, right? So, and your charges go up significantly if you keep on using minutes. So it's like a payday loan. So
Also, the data. So this happens with seniors a lot. They're offered a free phone for 16 gigabytes or whatever. And exactly what somebody previously was mentioning, you might need an app to be able to access your provider and you don't have room. And so 32G isn't enough they start taking pictures. They don't realize it, right? And they don't have room for the apps.
So we need to build insufficiency across devices and service.
Data and minutes.
Yeah, so perfect. Okay. And then maybe one more comment before we try to get through digital literacy because time is flying. Yes, Sarah?
Just as a provider, I think unless this is in later, but inadequate digital access, if the, the X, I mean, it could be like a comma individual versus community. So that way I know that I'm not picking the wrong one. Do you know what I mean?
I know, we kind of toyed with how to approach that, and I hear you. We had personal there, that didn't feel right. Because one of the
Yeah.
things that we're noting is that if you don't have community access, it's hard to have any of it. And so I hear you there. So individual might be a better approach if we're using community elsewhere. And so the thing
Yeah, because I'm afraid that somebody will use the community Z code and it will be not the right one. And that's what my fear is more just literacy of the provider.
Yeah, I know. Our own digital literacy. You'll see me that I assessed my own later on in the presentation, but okay. So I hear us needing to add elements that detail insufficiency and not just lack of. Noted. And I hear perhaps needing to clarify and simplify the do tos. And I hear needing maybe to center some kind of term here that differentiates it from community. Those are the themes I picked up. All right. And then just a note, this is a legacy term. We're just trying to figure out what to do with. Again, this kind of, does it fit? Does it belong? Does it stay? That is definitely what we're going to be doing over the course of the next 6 weeks, right? So it like examining little parts, refining them. Did it stay? Does it go? So we're just trying to figure out, because our new terms have this digital access theme, like what we do with are unable to obtain that came from material hardship. Okay, for the sake of time, trying to move through because there's a lot to cover. Next slide. So these are those goal statements that we use, right? So thinking about, and this is where there's a theme from National Digital Inclusion Alliance that we might want to bring back to the digital device terms, because we refined these a little bit, but we think about the things we're aiming for. These also, again, can be assets and other settings, but adequate digital access, enrolled in internet service. And Rita, you can see there you're mirroring that term again. And then we were trying to figure out, we looked at all of these different literatures and frameworks, like how to name the thing, right? The legacy term does seem more simple, and that follows a pattern that we have in material hardship. Yeah. It doesn't meet all the use cases though, because it has residence in it. So it can't be the only one. So maybe we just leave it. Because we're talking about access and residence versus access outside for the unhoused. And so we can't have it be the only one. So we have these 3 themes. We borrow the internet enabled digital device from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, because it seemed like the best way to determine, I don't just have a device, I have a device that can connect to the internet without saying that the connection exists. And then for now, we have not included, even though we can figure this out together over the next weeks, the simple able to afford concepts, because they can be definitely sub goals to full digital access. But we know that just because you can afford it doesn't mean you have it, especially with those Luddites that I take care of in Northern Vermont. So we can definitely put them there. They're terms that we built in with our material hardship and financial security build. But for right now, we're focusing on the specific digital access terms. Any other thoughts there?
Sarah, could you just clarify, digital device means a screen in your hand? We're not talking about monitoring your blood pressure, or are we? Device can refer to, is a rather general term.
Yeah, so maybe we need to refine that a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay, we're talking about a screen that relates to the internet.
Yep.
Okay.
We're not talking about like your loop recorder that's been in your heart, but is also sending pings via the internet to your cardiologist. So we do want to make sure that we're making that clear. We did pull this directly from National Digital Inclusion Alliance, but I recognize that it might not be sufficient if it's not clear.
We have a healthcare use case here, and we're talking about devices that relate to healthcare.
I know.
At least initially.
Yes, and so it's true that it should be. So Rita, what we wanted to not do if we could have avoided is build all the ways people access the internet via devices, tablets, smartphones, computers, there's all kinds of technologies that we talked about in our social connection work that are, geared towards older populations. So we were trying to create an inclusive term that allows for multiple different types of devices with appropriate citations. Hi, Kurt, you're here.
I made it on this time.
I know. Oh, Kurt's an old friend, and he joined. He had that broken link when he at the first meeting that many of you had and didn't join, and then I hunted him down. So glad. So I haven't been able to join the prior discussion, but we'll code. Yeah, so there's some literacy elements. So that's either if it's driven by lack of access in the community, that will be a term there. If it's driven by literacy, there's tons of terms there.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So we're trying to create an inclusive term for the types of devices that people use to engage in the internet that are not. So we don't have to build a term for every specific subtype. Really would love all of your ideas. Email us with ideas about how to do this better. This is directly from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Oh, thank you. So there we go. So Monique just added that. Monique's that kind of gal. So she's going to give us an example of maybe a refinement that allows us to specify that it's not a loop recorder or a remote blood pressure monitor. All right, are we good to go into digital literacy? Just because, again, for the sake of time, it is a big day and it's 4:44. Are we okay? Okay, carrying on. Next slide. Whew. Okay, oh, sorry. I think we went backwards, yeah. All right. I'm gonna not go through all the programs. I'm gonna go next slide. I'm just going to show you the themes, right? Because I really want to make sure that we review the digital literacy terms. This is a perfect thing to pull down in the master list and review as part of homework before you come back. And again, we have a whole month to see whether this is sufficient. You can see, again, thank you community for submitting some of these terms. We have affordable connectivity. We have telephone relay services. We have utility assistance programs. We have the everyone on locator tool, which can help you find a different program. So there's all kinds of digital access specific programs that we have as part of our work together. And thank you so much for our SMEs, and thank you so much for the community. Again, don't spend too much time on these. They all have formal definitions. This is perfect homework. Download the masters, make sure they're sufficient, fill in gaps, and then email us with any gaps that you see. Like if there's a critical national program that is not here, we want to know. Next slide. And these are the common ones that we go across all programs, like Always Area Agency on Aging, Always Community Action Agency, Always Care Managers, Community Health Workers, and Social Workers, right? So these are these themes that we have throughout all of our work. And again, please, and then libraries are a theme too. But because they do loaner, our library does loaner Chromebooks and tablets for people who don't have their own at the downtown library here in Burlington. So it's also a critical referral place. Again, please just download the master, review those so we can get into the digital literacy terms before we all turn into pumpkins. Next slide. And we're gonna burn through. There's been no changes in instruments, so we're just gonna keep on moving through all the way to digital literacy. We've had a perfect. Okay, take a breath. Maybe I'll even have a drink of my water, because now we have a lot to update in digital literacy, and this is why I wanted to make sure we got ourselves here. We were talking about boundaries at the last meeting. Like, how do we put a boundary on what is problematic within the vast spectrum of digital literacy? Because digital literacy can be everything from advanced digital skills as part of your job in the tech industry to learning to turn on your computer, right? So we recognize collectively that there is a vast range of competency within digital literacy. At present, there is no current gold standard US approach to scaling that full spectrum of digital literacy competence. And there's a few frameworks that do this scaling out there in the ecosystem, because one of the ways we can create boundaries is binding to a scale, like we did that for psychological stress. There's the perceived stress scale, or the food insecurity module, right? If there's a recognized gold standard US approach, you could scale to them. There's a couple examples of scaling we'll see later on in the presentation out there in Europe and Britain, but there's no gold standard US approach to scaling. But there are things, and again, it's like the team basically just did the qualitative research intensely with our subject matter experts over the course of the last few weeks, like reading literatures, reading frameworks, coding them, finding themes, making sure that we could get something that we could agree on that had boundaries and definitions in literature, and making sure that we could tell patient stories. Thank you. Yes, we have, yeah, so thank you so much, Janice. Yeah, that we have a whole library. I don't know if everyone saw the email. We have a whole library of frameworks. We wanted to bring you all along on our journeys. So there's a lot of references on the Confluence. What we do know is there's general agreement on the types of skills, or what we call the dimensions, across multiple frameworks. And we've talked about these before: communication, problem solving, information finding, right? So there's these themes that we can see across multiple frameworks. So these themes are comforting, right? So although there might be different frameworks, although they might be scaled differently, right, that core dimensions are in common. And there's also basic agreement on the basic knowledge, right? So when you look at the different frameworks and you're looking at the synthesis of them, what people define as the foundational elements or the basic elements are usually the same across the US approaches, across UK approaches, and across, Connecticut, nice, and across the EU approaches, right? So this is also comforting. So what we've arrived at, with a lot of thinking and a lot of talking and a lot of reflecting on the thoughts that you all brought to us over the last months, is that we're going to define what we can, which is basic skills, right? Basic digital literacy skills. We are aiming to enable use case specific items. And this is again where the healthcare use case comes in, Lucy, to enable plans of care, because what we know is basic skills are a problem if you don't have them at all. But many of the social engagements and responsibilities and capabilities that we have actually leverage and require skills beyond that basic set. Like I might need intermediate skills just to be able to get my associate's degree, or to do my air conditioner training because I'm a plumber, right? So the basic skills are so basic that in a digital society, patients can have barriers when you step beyond them. So we're going to look to use case specific terms that can enable that diagnosis and that problem. And we really are going to try to leave room for the ecosystem to evolve, because we've been talking about this as a theme. The digital space evolves really, really quickly. And so we don't want to box ourselves in, right? We don't want to pick one scaling methodology and have it change, right? So we're just going to leave room for the other things. So does that seem like it's, I hope it seems like a good approach, and you'll see it applied over the next slide. So next slide. All right, so this is an example of, the examples of those frameworks. So I talked about those common dimensions, right? Problem solving, communication, information, transaction, safety, right? So those are those themes across all the frameworks out there. And there's a really lovely paper that I sent around from Seattle that did a comparative analysis of all the different frameworks and elements that were in common. And that really helped my brain as well. Oh, sorry, the references got a little messed up. But the one on the left is the DigComp framework from the EU, and the one on the right is the UK Essential Digital Skills Framework. Their hyperlinks can take you to those. And again, they were part of our email, and they will be on Confluence. Okay, next slide. Out of humility, I took the DigComp skills test just to see how it played out, right? Because I thought it would be helpful for me to understand what the boundaries look like, right? So if I sit myself within the DigComp framework where Sarah Distel, the accidental informaticist, terminology director of the Gravity Project, am generally intermediate, right? I'm only advanced in communication and collaboration, which I probably doesn't surprise very many people, right? So it was helpful to me to apply this to myself and see where I fit in the ecosystem. But again, the collective ecosystem is not here, right? This is one of the possible scaling methodologies. It just helped me get deeper into the concepts and know how to go forward. Next slide, please. All right, so here's where we are. Some of these terms might not be as bounded as people want them to be, but again, if our aim is to represent where the US is, apply information we know and can reference, and tell patient stories that are critical, this is kind of where we need to sit. And even within the US, know that if the US Department of Ed is citing one framework, the US Agency for International Development is citing another, right? And the state of Maryland cites something different, right? So even in the US, there's not consensus on the framework of reference. And so it gets a bit tricky. So what we're suggesting is a general ICD-10 term for problem with digital literacy that can apply to multiple use cases, tell critical stories that are beyond basic literacy. It would represent being able to be applied to the full spectrum of digital literacy skills and be use case specific. The SNOMED CT term would be inadequate digital literacy skills. And we are moving from the American Library Association definition to the US Agency for International Development definition, because it does the best marrying of international approaches and US approaches that we could find, and it includes safety. Because the problem with the ALA definition is it did not include safety, and in all of the frameworks, we know the safety is a critical element, and it's part of what we assess in instruments. So we felt like we needed to use a definition that centered that. How are we feeling? Okay, who's feeling good? Okay, and then because we can, and because of all the things to intervene on that are high risk, again, thinking about how we differentiated sheltered from unsheltered homelessness, differentiating problems with basic digital literacy skills from the rest is really important, right? So for this, we're building off of the UK Essential Digital Skills Framework. And again, this theme is in common across all of the references and frameworks you see. But the definition is long, but again, there's instruments that help you get here. There are multiple frameworks to reference as being the driver of this. And these are the core things, right? It's the inability to perform any of the most fundamental tasks required to safely and securely set up a digital device to use online information and services. This includes turning on the device. And these are all pieces of that you can see across all the different frameworks. Turning on the device, logging in, including creating and changing passwords, understanding the controls and settings, connecting to Wi-Fi and internet, and opening browsers and applications. And this is all based on the Essential Digital Skills Framework. And now I'm going to be quiet, and I see Sarah has a question. Sarah.
I always sit from the trying to train people to do HCC codes and getting to the specificity that they really should.
Yeah.
And my concern is just problem with digital literacy. You would want has basic skills or something so that they don't pick because again, who knows if they're going to pick the right one. So just, having that in there as excluding basic or something.
Yeah.
Because
we would have to do that. Yeah.
Okay, good. I was just making sure.
Yeah. You are absolutely correct. And then Lucy?
Yeah, I'm interested in what the group thinks about another functionality in this inadequate basic digital literacy skills. Digital signature. That is coming up more and more. And granted that we need to set a boundary on our understanding of basic, I'm wondering what the group thinks about digital signature and whether we need to add that at this point.
I'm cautious to add anything that is not within the bounds of what is defined as basic across all of these frameworks. But that use case is a very good reason why we can't just use the basic digital skills term alone. That would be my thought. Anyone else?
I feel like that signature one would be in the top one.
Yes, it could be, you could tell the story with the top one, exactly, right? So Sarah, I think from the can I tell critical stories perspective, and yes, you could, yeah. But anyone else have thoughts there? Lucy, does it make sense so that I don't, because we're referencing a literature, we can't add something that's not already there?
I understand that an exercise like this has to start with the literature, but I also know from personal experience that the minute you read something in this realm, the internet, cyberspace, it's out of date. And so I raise this because in my life, it's coming up a lot. So I have no idea what the copyright dates are on the vast stack of stuff that you and our SMEs have read, but it's coming up a lot. So I thought I would bring it up and see whether the group thinks it's current enough to be rational to supersede the references which were written, I'm going to say, at least 2 and maybe more years ago when digital signatures weren't unknown.
Thank you for elevating that, Lucy.
Okay.
So we have some other questions here, and so we can figure out where these fit in. I'm gonna keep going a little bit because this is one of those instances where we're starting to refine, and I want you to see what we've already refined so that you all we can reflect. So I see Dr. Lucas talking about consent. We have elements about, what is now and what's going to happen in the future. We have elements of privacy and security, right? And so let's hold all those as we think about what we've got going forward, and then we'll see if we need to add other terms as well, because there's a whole bunch more terms to go. Next slide. I'm feeling like we're generally on the right track, though, with maybe needing to refine. So we have a goal of adequate basic digital literacy skills, which mirrors exactly that problem statement that we had on the other page. And then as a separate goal, we're also adding digital resilience from the literature of Digital US, which is clearly defined in the literature, which is kind of a meta term. So it would be having the awareness, skills, agility, and confidence to be empowered users of new technologies and adapt to changing digital demands. Thank you, Rita, for echoing the digital safety thing. I think we just want to make sure that we include safety, privacy, consent. There might need to be a specific use case about that. We can look at the specific use cases that are coming up. Next slide, I'm going to keep us moving on because there's a whole bunch more. So I pulled in this lovely graphic from Digital US on digital equity and digital resilience and how they interplay. Again, what lovely work they do. It was really lovely to do a deep dive there. Next slide. I'm going to take us to the next terms, right? So this is where we start to talk about use cases and maybe there's room to expand them. Yeah, I know, Lucy, it's changing. There's a lot out there. It changes fast. So basically where we arrived at was there was a, we could arrive at a common conceptual and operational definition of basic digital literacy, right? So there's instruments that could define the core elements. There's a definition, a conceptual definition in the literature. We could rest there. And this kind of highlights what you were saying, Lucy, and it talks about a little bit about what we see comments in the chat, and this is why we want to get it to you. But in an increasingly digital world, absence of even intermediate or advanced skills can be barriers to education, healthcare access, and employment. And again, we don't have this common international standard of scaling digital skills and applying them to different use cases. And so we brought this to you last time. We're kind of bringing it back. And we've had themes about how we've done this before in health literacy, is building terms to enable specific care based on specific use cases. And this is where maybe the consent thing would need to come in. Again, consent, privacy, all of that is inclusive in the definition of digital literacy, and across the frameworks, but maybe it needs to be a specific use case. We can play with that. Next slide, please. All right, so you have seen the healthcare access affected by inadequate digital literacy skills term before. That's an old friend. It's been here last time. In reflecting on the core use cases that really lean into and require those intermediate skills, again, I literally can name like scads of patients on my panel who I need to have, they have appointments with me to help them learn how to access the virtual educational opportunities to complete, a post high school degree or even their GED, right? Because there's no digital navigators in rural Vermont. I'm not like Atlanta, Asha. I want one, right? So telling these stories is really important. So this is beyond, there's that fluffy term, which is great. It can apply to any use case. We have the basic digital literacy term, which is clearly defined, and we know exactly the questions that will lead you to it. But these stories are very clearly driven by use case and really might be helpful in the ecosystem. So you have your healthcare access affected by inadequate digital literacy skills, your employment opportunities affected by inadequate digital literacy skills, and your education opportunities affected by inadequate digital literacy skills. We thought we'd start here, understanding that there's 1,000,001 use cases, but this big three, health, education, and employment, seem to be a good start. Lucy?
This is great. If I had known this like 45 minutes ago, I would not have been talking about the need to focus on health.
I'm so glad. I know. That's why I wanted to rush through. I'm like, wait.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so there's going to be codes here. Dot XYZ ABCDEFG to describe all this, so it can still be used for research about
Correct.
the percentage of population presenting for healthcare or social care encounters that lack healthcare access skills.
Correct.
Great.
And Sarah is correct. It's like we do try to allow what we call easy buttons. So if providers are not trained or even know that these codes exist, there's still a way to tell the story. But if there's actually specific instruments, and this is partly where our logic and our models, and we think about the IG as well, can help. There's specific instruments that ask about healthcare access, right? So you can imagine the instrument suggesting an outcome of this, right? So it's not just digital literacy alone, it's I cannot access healthcare because I do not know how to use the patient portal, right? So this is partly where once we have the terms, we can use the whole scope of what we do at Gravity to assist in documentation and storytelling. Again, not applying terms without talking to the patient. Suggesting things is different than coding things. We always recommend that humans interact with humans to tell stories that humans want to be told. But certainly the questions can map to the specific SOMA TT code. How are we feeling? Are we good? Socialization opportunities. Thank you, Sarah. Teresa, I need to know more.
Maybe Sarah, it's something like social connections affected by
I know.
inadequate.
Yeah. I wonder, is that what you mean, Teresa?
Yes, yeah, it's to combat the social isolation.
Oh, the funny thing is there's actually a lot of that in our social connection value set already. That's probably why I was talking about devices, because it gets really overwhelming. Because there's literally seals that function as friends. But I like the idea of considering whether, especially I think about, the current administration and the Surgeon General's focus on social isolation, that maybe specifically telling the use case of addressing social connection is important. So thank you, Teresa. That's really a good thing. Okay, we're not even done. Still more to come. Are we ready? Are we feeling okay? Again, we have this in a whole month to see whether this is enough. What we're trying to do is get in front of you all what what has happened, right? And there's a lot more to say. So I'm going to keep on going. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to run through the instruments again. Nothing's changed here. Moving along. All right. Okay. To this last bit that I want to make sure that we cover, and we actually doing okay on time. Right, so a lot of really wonderful friends raised really good questions about how assistive technologies and language translation and interpretation apply to these domains. And it seemed, and I told you I'd go back and look at how we did it with health literacy, and then we can see whether it works here. So we did that. Next slide, please. So this is basically patterns from health literacy applied. And what I want to ground us in is that one could imagine building translation, interpretation, plain language, and cultural culturally responsiveness for every single social need out there, because language barriers and cultural barriers and jargon are barriers to everything. They're barriers to applying for your food stamps. There's barriers to applying, to social engagement. There are barriers to employment. There are barriers to everything. So if we were trying to not create terms for every single social need, this is kind of where we grounded ourselves, is that it's reasonable to build specific terms when communication is a fundamental dimension of the domain. And we saw all of our frameworks, right, earlier, and we know that communication, problem solving, these like interactive human elements were very much part of digital literacy. And they're very much part of health literacy, right? Reading, talking. And so it's very reasonable, we think, to follow the pattern of health literacy as we did before and build concepts that talk about when language translation, when jargon and cultural responsiveness are required for addressing digital literacy. I'm going to remind anyone who wasn't here last year that the reason why we built these terms this way is it centers on the system's need to do something to meet the person. Right? Because in literacy, there's organizational literacy and then personal literacy. So we built these terms within health literacy because this is when I, as a provider, need to de-jargon my language. I, as a clinic, need to offer translation. I, as a person, need to ensure I have either a cultural peer, or do a deep dive to be culturally responsive in order to meet that person, right? Because the literature of literacy really makes sure that you think about personal level and organizational level. So that's why these terms are crafted this way. So understanding that communication is a key part of digital literacy and health literacy, we can 100% imagine building all of these terms in common. And then understanding assistive technology is a critical aspect of both. We thought it'd be really easy to imagine building a requires assistive technology to support digital access term, and it acquires assistive technology to support digital literacy. Whew. How are we feeling? So this is directly in response to what you've all said. Sarah?
I really do love this. And I also love that in this storytelling, my vision just working in digital health is that the patient gets finally access to agency to have these resources that they can turn on for themselves. So if we were to say they get a digital literacy, they also then get a language, tool that they just carry around with them everywhere. So they don't have to rely on, responsible and ethical behavior in medical practice, even though that should be already assumed. So then we can actually get them the tool and not have to worry about even them feeling, this is just an inequitable care model. It's actually that we are then putting a claim in so that whatever payer can actually give them the tool that they deserve so that they can have agency.
Yes, this is part of our this is the method by which, yes, I love that. And it's just like documenting system level instructional responsibility is a core Gravity tenet. So Teresa has a question regarding definitions for plain language. We do have some literature. So there's a really lovely federal US government definition for plain language we can get out to you. We used it for health literacy. We can put that back in the ecosystem. The US government's approach to centering plain language in all of its communications is actually pretty clear, and there's really lovely definitions for what the basis of those are. Lucy, I just used Google Translate to assist a non-English speaking person in a medical crisis on a plane. Just on my way back from Seattle. I had my first "is there a doctor on the plane" moment, and I was like, yes, there is. So I just had to use it to help a patient just a week ago. There's also actually interesting use of ChatGPT, which but a lot of providers are using it to craft education in the appropriate language for the person in the moment of the visits. No application of Google Translate to actual clinical work. Yes, I'm so sorry. My application on the plane was desperation. Does the term on-assistive technology fit more accurately, appropriately under digital access? Oh, you mean how does it, you're wondering whether it should be removed from digital literacy? Is that what you're saying, Tom?
Yes, that's what I'm questioning.
What does the community think about that one?
Well, that one, Sarah, I thought when we went over that, we thought that, definitely you might need it to support access, but you also, if you have issues and we don't know what those are, you may even need it to support digital literacy. And I didn't know, whether that's a communication issue that you don't to me, it felt like we probably could use it in both, but I think we had that same thought. It'll be interesting to hear.
Anyone else feel whether it should be removed from digital literacy, that it centers more appropriately in?
I don't
Well, if
think
we're
there's any
talking-
harm in keeping them both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both areas works.
Okay. How are we doing? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what we recognize is though we had a framework for applying why digital literacy should have the full build out, because communication and problem solving are core elements, core dimensions of the domain. It makes us think that we should consider, which we have not done, high level all domain terms. The problem is that we have language barriers on our roadmap. So we're kind of hesitant to lean, because we did this before with material hardship, where we built into spaces, and then now that we have the right subject matter experts and the right frame of reference to lead into digital access specifically, our approach is different, right? So we could go ahead and build general finding terms. However, we don't know if we should pause on that because of the work to come. And we also imagine, and Sarah was speaking to this a little bit, creating intervention terms that talk about the action, like I have done this, right? And again, this is kind of work in progress. It's all in italics because it's not necessarily applied to this use case right now, but we want to be responsible to it. So we'll probably revisit it in future domains, but just wanted to make sure that you all saw that we acknowledge this gap. Hello, yes? Hello, Gerardo?
Yes, thank you. I think that using these terms, not only the language barrier term might be a better idea, given the fact that there are multiple actions and interventions that can happen, and they may not all be perhaps SACT or put together as language barrier only. Many people don't even understand the difference between interpretation and translation. So I
Yeah.
think that making a difference of that, in addition to giving clear tasks that they may accomplish or have accomplished, might serve better, just like in any other areas in clinical work.
So is that what, are you mirroring what I said, which is that this is important enough that it should be reserved to when we can do it appropriately in a language barrier domain, in a language domain, or how would you suggest that we approach it? Just want to make sure that I hear what you're saying well.
I think that we should break down this into multiple terms.
Yeah.
The timing of that, maybe up for discussion, but I think that breaking it down into specific terms or actions might be a better option.
Fantastic. I think you're saying what we felt, which is part of the work that we do in Gravity. And actually, both of these domains came out of working in other domains and recognizing a need to focus with intention on something that we found, that we highlighted, right? And I think I hear you saying that given that the work of addressing and understanding language barriers and translation and interpretation could warrant a really focused deep dive that does it justice. Is that what I think? Have I synthesized well?
Agreed, and I think that it is important to break it down, as I was mentioning, because
Yeah.
There are current efforts led by multiple agencies in the
Right.
federal government,
Yes.
and there are specifics as to reporting internally for different actions, and they are mostly reflected in here. And I think that it could be a very good way to coincide with those efforts.
Fantastic. Okay, lovely. And what that helps is drive the why in the prioritization of next things, right? So if we recognize this as a critical element applicable across all domains, it's wise to lean into that to make sure that we do that justice in our next work. Any other thoughts on what we just presented, which is a lot? And my apologies for the joke about using Google Translate. It's not in clinic, it was just on the plane. But it was necessary in the moment. Anything else to say here, Sarah?
Just quickly, I think also identifying that had a family member to translate, when we think about these like kind of scenarios, I mean, obviously that's not part of the storytelling in that perspective, but I think when we go into the language, prefers, having a family member interpret, but like that at least justifies you gave them options, or that like there was another person present and it wasn't through the patient's words, could be very useful, since I still foresee culturally that might be something that we need to include in the story.
Yeah, all of this highlighting that this is good work to be done well with the right people. And then I might know what you're going to say, Gerardo. What if you want to unmute and speak?
Yeah, I don't mean to be the naysayer here.
No,
but,
I hear I think I know what you're going to say.
but there are multiple reasons not to use or not to recommend the use of relatives or people accompanying patients that are not professionals to do interpretation for them. One, because if they're a relative, they should provide emotional support, but they should not be loaded with the need for linguistic interpretation at a professional level. And second, because most likely 99.9% of the times they are untrained individuals, most likely heritage speakers, and there's plenty of evidence that indicates that is more harmful than good. And besides, in addition to all of that, the national class standards, cultural linguistically appropriate service standards, indicate also discouraging the use of family members, particularly minors, for these kinds of roles.
So I think
totally agree.
We have a pretty good case for centering language. If we've done 2 literacy domains that revisit the need to lean into language, then it makes sense to center that in our roadmap next. So I just want to honor that this conversation is really good for firing us up to make sure that we do that well. Okay, I think we're close. Okay, a lot of information presented. None of this is on the master list yet. It's going to be there on Friday, but I hope you all see us trying to integrate the wisdom that you all have offered over the course of the last month, right? The references you've all offered, the need to center access and assistive technologies, need to consider different elements. We're going to make sure that we include there's some the really important things, like not just lack of, right? We're going to try to make sure that we build in space for not good enough in an access, like not enough minutes, as opposed to not having any. We might be able to tell that story still with lack of, depending on the moment, but we hear you. Next slide. Thanks for being on this 1.5 hour long journey with us today. Next slide. We're going to move through this and then center on the homework, I think, because there's nothing else new in here. It's just all the same old, same old. All right, homework. Breathe. I know I need to take a breath. Catch up on materials on the Confluence. Again, if there's anything, if I ask you to submit an email, we really would love for you to submit that email and give us references if there's something that you noticed that we could integrate in. If we missed something, please send an instrument to us or a program type. Again, the masters will be on the Confluence at the end of the day tomorrow, so pretty safe to access them on Monday morning or Monday. That's where we're going to be able to review those programs. We'll be able to kind of sit back and look at the set of information we've identified over the course of the last few weeks and last months. We are entering into end-to-end review, and that end-to-end review, the purpose of it is to see whether it's sufficient. Have we enabled the language to tell the stories we need to tell with a degree of specificity that allows what we call semantic consistency? Like, you over there will understand what I'm trying to say over here, because we've defined it in a way that is common. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Next slide. All right, join us next in 2 weeks. We will look forward to seeing you. Join us on the technical work streams from 1 to 2. Join us as we work through the pilot work stream the last Thursday of the month. Very exciting things happen over there in pilots. And we just thank you all for being community members. Thanks for sitting in the complexity of this with us and working it through. And we are so grateful for you, and have a lovely weekend. Thanks for the work today. You all worked very hard. We'll see you
We
soon.
are so grateful for you, Sarah, conveying all of this, trying to make something understandable out of this huge chaos.
We have an amazing collective, the Gravity team and the subject matter experts and all of you all. It definitely is a Venn diagram of knowledge making. Yeah, as we all.
It shows. It's
Yeah.
great.
Thank you so.
And Sarah, there are still questions. I still see Gerardo's.
Gerardo, do you have your question? Another question, or do you just not lower your hand? We want to make sure.
And also Lisa Wolf. Sarah had one in the chat.
Oh, Lisa Wolf had one in the chat. Okay. Oh, on homework. In the interventions, I do not see the March SNOMED concepts, U.S. Extensions with Education with Digital Literacy Program. Oh yeah, so if there's something that was just released that we didn't have, send it off. Send it to us.
And I think Himali is in the process of catching up. You know, there's cycles for that, Sarah, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It will be there soon.
Yeah, but just as a point of process, if you do not see something on the master, an email to us is always the way to ensure it gets addressed. We log every email. I hope that was like a general answer. Himali is amazing at what she does. But if it's missing, that's the best way. Okay, I think we're good. All right. Bye, friends. See you in a couple weeks.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.